The wind moved first. It swept across the plains of Central Europe in the early months of 1241, carrying with it the last quiet moments before rupture. These lands, fragmented, proud, and politically divided, had not yet grasped the scale of what was coming. Rumors traveled faster than armies, but even rumors struggled to contain the reality unfolding beyond the eastern horizon. For years, the expansion of the Mongol Empire had seemed distant, almost abstract. Cities had fallen in Asia. Kingdoms had collapsed in rust. But distance had provided comfort. Distance always does. That illusion was now ending. The force advancing toward Europe was not merely another invading army. It was a system, precise, disciplined, and terrifyingly efficient. Under the command of Batu Khan and the brilliant strategist Subutai, the Mongol war machine had already dismantled the principalities of Kiev and Rus with calculated brutality. Entire regions had been erased not only physically, but structurally, leadership destroyed, resistance preemptively neutralized. Europe, by contrast, was not prepared for this kind of war. It was not merely a question of numbers. It was a question of mindset. In the early 13th century, Central Europe existed as a mosaic of duchies, principalities, and loosely aligned kingdoms. Authority was layered and often contested. Loyalties shifted between rulers, and cooperation, while possible, was rarely seamless. Poland was no exception. The Polish territories were divided among regional dukes, each holding influence within their own domain. Among them stood Henry II the Pious, a man shaped by both political inheritance and necessity. As Duke of Silesia, he carried the burden of defense, not only for his own lands, but increasingly for a region that found itself exposed. Because the Mongols were not advancing randomly, they were executing a strategy. The Mongol invasion of Europe in 1241 was not a singular thrust. It was a coordinated, multi-pronged operation designed to fracture resistance before it could consolidate. One column advanced into Hungary, another moved into Poland. Their objectives were interconnected: isolate, confuse, and prevent unified defense. Subutai understood Europe's greatest weakness: disunity. If the Polish, Bohemian, and Hungarian forces were allowed to merge, they could form a substantial opposition, not equal to the Mongols in tactical sophistication, but formidable in sheer manpower. That could not be allowed. So the Mongols moved swiftly into Poland, not necessarily to conquer immediately, but to disrupt it, to draw its armies out, to destroy them in isolation. By early 1241, reports began arriving in Silesia. Towns burned in Lesser Poland. Krakow had fallen. Refugees fled westward, carrying fragmented accounts of an enemy that did not behave like any army Europe had known. They spoke of riders who appeared suddenly, attacked relentlessly, and vanished before a counterstrike could form. There were no clear battle lines, no predictable patterns, and perhaps most unsettling of all, no hesitation. Henry II understood the implications quickly. This was not a raid. This was an organized invasion with operational depth. He began assembling forces. But even that process revealed the structural limitations of medieval Europe. Feudal armies were not standing forces. They were summoned. Knights, levies, mercenaries, and allied contingents had to be called from across regions, each bringing their own timelines, obligations, and varying levels of discipline. Coordination required time. Time required stability. The Mongols allowed neither. Still, Henry gathered what he could. Polish troops formed the core of his force: regional knights, infantry levies, and retainers bound by feudal duty. To strengthen his position, he secured support from neighboring powers. German knights joined the ranks, alongside contingents from Silesia and Moravia. Even elements of the Knights Templar contributed experienced warriors. Individually, these forces were capable. Some were battle-hardened. Many were motivated, but they had never fought together at this scale. And more importantly, they had never faced an enemy like the Mongols. While Henry assembled his army, the Mongols continued their advance with deliberate pacing. They did not rush blindly into confrontation. Instead, they shaped the battlefield long before the battle itself. Scouting units spread across the countryside, mapping terrain, tracking movements, and identifying potential concentrations of enemy forces. Intelligence flowed continuously back to Mongol commanders, allowing them to adapt in real time. European armies, by contrast, operated with limited reconnaissance. Information was slower, often outdated, sometimes incorrect. This imbalance would prove decisive. The psychological dimension of the Mongol campaign was equally calculated. They did not simply defeat armies. They dismantled morale. Survivors carried stories, not just of defeat, but of annihilation. Entire settlements erased. Resistance crushed without negotiation. These accounts spread ahead of the Mongols, softening targets before the first arrow was ever loosed. Fear became a weapon, and in many cases, it arrived before the army itself. By the time Henry II's forces began to coalesce near the Silesian region, the Mongols had already achieved a critical objective. They had forced Europe into a reactive posture. Instead of coordinating a unified defense across multiple kingdoms, European leaders were responding locally, each attempting to protect their own territory, often without full awareness of the broader strategic picture. This fragmentation was exactly what Subutai intended, because while Henry was preparing for battle, other Mongol forces were simultaneously advancing deeper into Hungary, drawing additional attention and resources away from Poland. Europe was being divided, not geographically, but operationally. The choice of battlefield would soon emerge near the town of Liegnitz, known in Latin as Liegnitz. It was not a grand fortress, not a strategically fortified city, but it sat within a region that allowed movement, open enough for cavalry, yet structured enough to channel engagement. The Mongols preferred such terrain. It allowed them to exploit their greatest strengths: mobility, coordination, and deception. Henry II's army, by most estimates, significantly outnumbered the Mongol force facing them. This numerical advantage offered a degree of confidence. In traditional European warfare, numbers mattered. Heavier cavalry charges, supported by infantry, could overwhelm lighter forces. Knights, armored and trained for direct engagement, represented the decisive element on the battlefield. But this assumption rested on a critical condition: that the enemy would fight conventionally. The Mongols would not. As Henry advanced toward Liegnitz, he faced mounting pressure, not only from the approaching enemy, but from time itself. There were expectations from allies, from subjects, from the broader Christian world. The Mongol advance had already shattered the illusion of distance. Now it demanded a response. Waiting for reinforcements from Bohemia, particularly from Wenceslaus I of Bohemia, might have strengthened his position, but waiting carried its own risks. Delay could mean further devastation across Polish lands. Delay could allow the Mongols to maneuver freely. Delay could project weakness. So Henry made a decision. He would engage. It was a choice shaped by incomplete information. He did not know the full scale of the Mongol strategy. He did not know the precise disposition of their forces. And he did not fully understand the methods they would employ. But he understood enough to recognize the necessity of confrontation, or what appeared to be necessity. As both forces moved toward Liegnitz, the contrast between them became increasingly stark. On one side, a coalition army, brave, numerous, but fragmented in structure and experience. On the other, a smaller force, highly disciplined, unified in command, and guided by a doctrine refined through decades of conquest. The outcome of such encounters is rarely determined at the moment of impact. It is shaped long before, through preparation, through understanding, through the ability to impose one's method of war onto the opponent. And in the quiet hours before the battle, as camps settled and scouts returned with fragments of information, one reality began to take form, though not yet fully understood. This would not be a contest of strength. It would be a test of systems, of adaptability, of perception, because the Mongols were not merely arriving to fight. They were arriving to control how the battle would unfold. And once that control was established, collapse would follow. Morning did not arrive with clarity. It came slowly, filtered through a low haze that hung over the fields near Liegnitz. The land itself appeared unremarkable. Open stretches broken by gentle undulations, patches of woodland in the distance, and narrow pathways worn by local travel. It was not a battlefield chosen for grandeur. It was chosen for control. By the time the sun began to lift the mist, both armies were already in motion. Henry II the Pious organized his forces according to the conventions he understood best. The army was divided into multiple banners, distinct contingents grouped by origin and command. Polish knights formed the backbone, supported by infantry levies drawn from surrounding regions. German forces, more experienced in structured warfare, held key positions. The presence of the Knights Templar added a hardened element to the formation. Disciplined cavalry accustomed to prolonged conflict. The structure reflected medieval logic. Heavy cavalry positioned for decisive charges. Infantry to support and stabilize the line. Reserves held behind, ready to exploit breakthroughs or reinforce faltering sectors. It was a system built for confrontation, for impact, for a battle that would be decided through force applied directly against force. Across the field, the Mongol army appeared fundamentally different. Under the command structure influenced by Subutai and operated within the broader campaign directed by Batu Khan, their forces did not form a static line. They moved constantly. Light cavalry units spread outward, maintaining distance while probing the edges of the European formation. Mounted archers advanced and withdrew in controlled patterns, never committing fully, never presenting a fixed target. To an observer unfamiliar with Mongol warfare, the formation might have appeared loose, almost disorganized. It was not. It was deliberate. Each movement was coordinated, each unit aware of its role within a larger operational design. The Mongol army was structured around flexibility. Units could separate, regroup, and adapt without waiting for centralized commands. Communication relied on signals, flags, horns, and practice coordination, allowing rapid shifts in formation. Where European forces sought stability, the Mongols embraced motion, and motion on this field would become decisive. The engagement did not begin with a full-scale clash. It began with distance. Mongol horse archers advanced into range, releasing volleys of arrows before withdrawing just beyond effective pursuit. The arrows themselves were not always intended to kill outright. Many struck shields, armor, horses, disrupting cohesion, provoking reaction. This was the first layer of pressure, not physical destruction, but psychological destabilization. Within Henry's ranks, the effect was immediate. Knights trained for direct engagement found themselves unable to respond effectively. Their strength lay in close combat, in the momentum of a charge. Here, they faced an enemy that refused to stand still. Infantry units raised shields, absorbing the incoming fire, but the lack of clear engagement created uncertainty. Where was the main attack? When would it come? The battlefield offered no answers, only movement. Henry's challenge was not simply to command, it was to interpret. He needed to determine whether this harassment represented the full extent of the Mongol strategy, or merely its opening phase. Delayed too long, and morale could erode under constant pressure. Advanced too quickly, and the army risked disorder. The Mongols understood this tension. They relied on it. Eventually, the decision came, a forward assault. European cavalry began to advance, initially controlled, then accelerating as the distance closed. The expectation was familiar. Engage the enemy directly, break their formation, and force a decisive confrontation. But the Mongols did not meet the charge. They withdrew. This was not retreat as understood in European warfare. It was controlled withdrawal. A feigned retreat, one of the most effective and dangerous tactics in Mongol doctrine. As the Mongol units pulled back, they maintained cohesion, continuing to fire arrows even while retreating. The movement created the illusion of weakness, of collapse, and for forces conditioned to interpret retreat as opportunity, the effect was powerful. European cavalry pressed forward. Momentum built. Lines began to stretch. Coordination weakened as individual units pursued at varying speeds, driven by the instinct to exploit what appeared to be a faltering enemy. This was the second layer of pressure. Inducement, encouraging the opponent to abandon structure voluntarily. From a distance, the battlefield began to change shape. What had started as a cohesive European advance was becoming fragmented. Gaps formed between units. Command signals struggled to propagate across the expanding front. Dust rose beneath hooves, reducing visibility, adding to confusion. And still, the Mongols withdrew, drawing the European forces further from their original positions. At a critical distance, the pattern shifted. The retreat slowed, then stopped. Mongol units began to wheel outward, pivoting on the flanks of the advancing European forces. Additional contingents, previously unseen or positioned beyond immediate visibility, moved into place. The field, once open, was now being enclosed, not through static lines, but through motion converging from multiple directions. Henry's forward units, having advanced aggressively, found themselves isolated. The cohesion of the original formation had been compromised. Support elements lagged behind. Communication between banners had broken down, and in that moment, the Mongols transitioned from evasion to engagement. Arrows intensified, not scattered volleys, but concentrated fire directed at specific units. Horses were targeted, crippling mobility, throwing riders into disarray. Commanders became focal points, recognizable by armor and position. Disruption spread quickly within the European ranks. The experience shifted from anticipation to confusion. The expected collision, the decisive clash, had not occurred. Instead, the battle was dissolving into fragmented engagements. Small groups fighting in isolation, units attempting to regroup under continuous pressure. Signals lost in noise and dust. The Knights Templar, positioned with greater discipline, attempted to maintain formation, resisting the instinct to pursue recklessly. Their cohesion allowed them to withstand initial pressure more effectively than surrounding units. But even discipline has limits when the structure around it begins to collapse. Because the Mongol strategy did not rely on breaking a single point, it relied on breaking connections. Meanwhile, Mongol forces introduced another element: smoke. Sources describe the use of smoke or dust clouds, possibly enhanced through deliberate means, to obscure vision further. Whether through burning materials or coordinated movement, the effect was the same. Visibility deteriorated. Identification became difficult. Friend and foe blurred at distance. In such conditions, command becomes fragile. Orders cannot travel clearly. Responses arrive too late. And individual units begin to act independently, not out of disobedience, but necessity. This was a third layer of pressure, disorientation. Henry II's position, somewhere behind the advancing elements, became increasingly precarious. Information reaching him was fragmented, reports of engagement from multiple directions, uncertainty about the position of reserves, no clear understanding of the enemy's full disposition. The battlefield he had intended to control was no longer coherent. It was shifting, reshaping itself faster than decisions could be made. At the edges of engagement, Mongol units continued to maneuver with precision. They avoided prolonged close combat where unnecessary, instead maintaining pressure through mobility and ranged attacks. When opportunities appeared, isolated groups exposed flanks. They closed in briefly, delivering decisive strikes before disengaging again. This pattern repeated across the field. Not chaotic, systematic. European forces, by contrast, were now reacting, attempting to stabilize, attempting to reform lines that had already dissolved. Individual acts of resistance occurred. Knights rallying small groups, infantry holding defensive positions, but these efforts lacked coordination. And without coordination, effectiveness diminished rapidly. The battle had not yet reached its conclusion, but its direction was becoming clear. The initial advantage, numerical strength, heavy cavalry, defensive positioning, had been eroded not through direct confrontation, but through manipulation. The Mongols had dictated the pace. They had dictated the movement. And most critically, they had dictated the conditions under which the battle was being fought. By the time realization began to spread through Henry's ranks, it was already late, because the final phase of the Mongol strategy was not to engage a strong, unified army. It was to confront an army that had already begun to fragment. And once fragmentation reaches a certain threshold, it no longer requires overwhelming force to produce collapse, only precision and timing. By late morning, the battle no longer resembled a contest between two armies. It had become a series of disconnected struggles unfolding across a widening field, each one shaped by confusion, isolation, and the gradual erosion of control. What remained of the European advance was now fractured, and the Mongols understood exactly how to finish it. The transition into the final phase was not marked by a single decisive charge. It emerged through convergence. Mongol units, having drawn their opponents out and disrupted their formations, began tightening their operational arcs. Where earlier they had dispersed to provoke and fragment, they now closed inward, compressing the battlefield around isolated clusters of European forces. This was not encirclement in the traditional sense. It was dynamic containment, moving boundaries that adjusted continuously, preventing escape while maintaining pressure. Within these shifting boundaries, European units attempted to reorganize. Knights gathered where they could, forming defensive knots around banners or recognizable leaders. Infantry raised shields in tight formations, bracing for contact that never came in the way they expected. Because even now, the Mongols avoided committing to sustained close combat unless conditions were overwhelmingly favorable. They did not need to. The battlefield was already working in their favor. At the center of this disintegration stood Henry II the Pious. His position, once anchored within a structured command system, had become increasingly uncertain. Communication lines had collapsed. Signals could not travel reliably through the dust, smoke, and movement. What reached him were fragments, reports of units engaging enemies in multiple directions, accounts of cavalry advancing and not returning, indications that the line, if it could still be called a line, no longer held. In such conditions, leadership becomes an exercise in limitation, not in commanding events, but in attempting to contain their consequences. Henry faced a narrowing set of options: attempt to withdraw, risking further fragmentation under pressure; hold position, inviting encirclement; or attempt a localized counterattack to regain initiative. Each carried its own risks. But time at this stage was no longer a neutral factor. It favored the Mongols. Across the field, the Mongol command structure remained intact. Signals continued to flow. Units adjusted positions with discipline. The coordination that had shaped the early phases of the battle now enabled precise exploitation. When a European unit attempted to regroup, Mongol cavalry shifted to isolate it. When resistance stiffened in one area, pressure was redirected elsewhere. The battlefield was no longer reactive. It was controlled. One of the most decisive elements in this phase was targeting. Mongol forces focused not only on mass engagement, but on key nodes within the opposing force. Commanders, standard bearers, clusters of heavy cavalry attempting to reorganize. By disrupting these focal points, they accelerated the breakdown of cohesion, because in medieval warfare, cohesion was not just structural, it was symbolic. Men fought not only for survival, but for the banner they could see. When that banner disappeared or fell, the psychological effect could be immediate. The Knights Templar, among the most disciplined elements on the field, continued to resist with relative cohesion. Their training allowed them to maintain formation longer than surrounding units, and their experience in sustained combat provided a measure of stability. But even they were not immune to the larger dynamics unfolding around them. As adjacent forces collapsed or withdrew, their position became increasingly exposed. Discipline, in isolation, cannot compensate for systemic breakdown. At some point, difficult to pinpoint precisely, the battle crossed an invisible threshold. It was no longer recoverable, not because every unit had been destroyed, but because the structure that allowed those units to function collectively had been irreversibly lost. From that moment, the outcome was no longer in question, only its completion. Accounts suggest that during this phase, the Mongols employed a final intensification of pressure, tightening their attacks, closing distances when advantageous, and eliminating remaining pockets of organized resistance. Close combat did occur, but it was brief, decisive, localized. Mongol units would engage, overwhelm, and withdraw, never lingering long enough to become fixed targets themselves. Some European knights attempted to break through the encirclement. Charges were launched, not as coordinated offensives, but as desperate efforts to escape the closing perimeter. A few may have succeeded in reaching the outskirts of the battlefield. Most did not, because the Mongol system was designed not merely to defeat, but to anticipate such reactions. Escape routes were monitored. Flanking units repositioned rapidly. What appeared as an opening often closed before it could be fully exploited. The death of Henry II the Pious marked the symbolic end of the battle. Details vary across sources, but the outcome is consistent. He was killed amidst the chaos. His body later identified, his head reportedly taken by the Mongols as proof of victory. In medieval warfare, the death of a commander carried weight beyond the immediate loss of leadership. It signaled finality. With organized resistance collapsing, what followed was not pursuit in the traditional sense. It was systematic elimination of remaining threats. Scattered groups were hunted down. Survivors, disoriented and isolated, found little opportunity to regroup. The battlefield, once defined by movement and noise, began to settle, but not into silence, into aftermath. The scale of the defeat was staggering. An army that had assembled from multiple regions, representing one of the largest offensive efforts in the area, had been dismantled by a significantly smaller force, not through direct confrontation, but through method, through understanding, through control of the battle structure from beginning to end. And yet, the significance of Liegnitz extends beyond the immediate loss, because it revealed something fundamental. Europe had encountered a system of warfare it did not yet understand. The Mongols did not rely on superiority in numbers. They relied on superiority in coordination, intelligence, and adaptability. They transformed the battlefield from a place of confrontation into a process, one that could be shaped, manipulated, and concluded on their terms. At Liegnitz, that process reached its full expression, but the battle itself was not the final objective. It was part of a larger campaign. While European forces in Poland were being defeated near Liegnitz, other Mongol armies were simultaneously achieving decisive victories in Hungary. The fragmentation of European resistance, so effectively exploited here, was being replicated elsewhere. Subutai's design extended beyond a single battlefield. It encompassed an entire region. And yet, despite the scale of these victories, the Mongol advance into Europe would not continue indefinitely, not because of defeat, but because of events far from the battlefield. The death of the great Khan, Ogidi Khan, required the return of key leaders to Mongolia for succession. Strategic momentum paused. The expansion halted. Europe, in that moment, was spared further immediate advance. But the lessons of Liegnitz remained, though not always fully understood at the time. They would echo through future encounters. The importance of coordination, the dangers of fragmentation, the limitations of traditional assumptions when faced with a fundamentally different system of war. In the end, Liegnitz was not simply a defeat. It was a demonstration of how an army could be dismantled before it ever fully engaged, of how perception could be manipulated, of how control, exercised early, maintained consistently, could determine the outcome long before the final blow was delivered. And across the plains where the battle had unfolded, the wind returned, moving over ground that, hours earlier, had been shaped by movement, decision, and collapse. Now, it carried only what remained: fragments of armor, broken standards, and the quiet, enduring evidence of a battle decided not by strength, but by understanding.